The autumn air in Oak Haven, Indiana, had a particular crispness to it, a scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves that clung to everything. For Sarah Jenkins, it was the smell of home, of predictable seasons, and the quiet comfort of a life meticulously built. Her world was the gentle rhythm of her husband Mark's return from the local hardware store he managed, the hum of the refrigerator in their small but tidy kitchen, and, most importantly, the soft, gurgling sounds from the nursery. Jeremiah, her son, was 2 years old, a whirlwind of chubby limbs and wide, inquisitive blue eyes. He was a quiet child, observant and calm, and his verbal development was slow. The pediatrician had assured them it was normal. "Boys are often late talkers," Dr. Miller had said with a reassuring smile. "He's hitting every other milestone. Just give him time." Sarah gave him time. She read to him every night, pointing to pictures of cows and dogs, exaggerating the moo and the woof until Mark would chuckle from the doorway. Jeremiah would just watch her, his expression unreadable, his silence a deep, placid pool. The first time the word came, it wasn't mama or dada. Jeremiah was sitting on the living room rug, meticulously stacking colored blocks. A sunbeam cut through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He looked up not at her, but at the light itself, and said, with perfect, lilting clarity, "Lux Eterna." Sarah froze, a half-folded piece of laundry in her hands. It sounded like nonsense, a strange collection of syllables he'd invented. "What was that, sweetie?" she asked, her voice light. He didn't respond, his attention already back on the blocks. She dismissed it. Babbling, that's all it was. A new kind of babbling. But a week later, it happened again. Mark was at work, and the house was quiet except for the gentle rain tapping against the glass. Jeremiah was standing by the window, his small hand pressed against the cool pane, watching the droplets race each other down. He sighed, a tiny, world-weary sound from a 2-year-old's body, and whispered, "Aquavity." This time, the clarity was unnerving. It wasn't the clumsy formation of sounds of a toddler learning to speak. It was articulate, the vowels pure, the consonants precise. A chill, unrelated to the damp autumn day, prickled Sarah's skin. She quietly took out her phone and started a voice memo, leaving it to record on the kitchen counter. Over the next few days, she captured more. "Pax vobiscum," he said to the sleeping cat. "Corpus meum," he mumbled, patting his own chest. They were ghosts of words, hauntingly familiar but completely alien. One night, after putting Jeremiah to bed, she sat at the computer, the audio file open. She typed the sounds phonetically into a search engine. The results came back instantly, a cold, digital confirmation of her growing fear. Latin. Lux Eterna, eternal light. Aquavity, water of life. Pax vobiscum, peace be with you. Corpus meum, my body. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was impossible. They didn't have any connection to the language. Mark was a lifelong Oak Haven resident, and she'd grown up 2 counties over. They weren't religious. The last time they'd been in a church was for a wedding years ago. There were no old books in the house, no documentaries on ancient Rome playing in the background. Their lives were a curated collection of modern, Midwestern simplicity. When Mark came home, she waited until after dinner, her anxiety a knot in her stomach. "Mark, we need to talk about Jeremiah," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "He's been saying things. Words." Mark leaned back in his chair, a tired but gentle smile on his face. "Oh yeah, finally getting some words out of him. What's he saying? Is it dada yet?" "No, it's different." She played the recording. The small, clear voice filled the quiet kitchen. Mark's smile faded, replaced by a frown of confusion. "What is that? Is that from a cartoon?" "It's Latin, Mark," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "I looked it up, all of it. He's speaking Latin." He stared at her, then at the phone, then back at her. "Latin? Sarah, that's crazy. He's 2. He probably heard it somewhere, and he's just mimicking the sounds. You know, like a parrot. Maybe one of your shows was on." "I don't watch shows like that. He's not mimicking, Mark. The way he says it, it's like he knows what it means. Today, he pointed at the light and said, eternal light. He pointed at the rain and said, water of life. It's contextual. Mark ran a hand through his hair, a deep line forming between his brows. Okay, honey, slow down. Let's be rational. There has to be a logical explanation. There's no such thing as a 2-year-old spontaneously speaking a dead language. Maybe he has an ear infection, and it's distorting how he hears and makes sounds. We'll take him to Dr. Miller. He was trying to be the anchor, the voice of reason, but Sarah could see the flicker of fear in his eyes, a fear that mirrored her own. He was scared not just of the phenomenon, but for her. The breaking point came a few days later. The air was heavy, pregnant with a coming storm. Sarah and Jeremiah were in his room, the alphabet blocks scattered across the floor. He was building a tall, precarious tower. As he placed the final block, the tower swayed, teetered for a moment, and then collapsed with a clatter of wood on wood. Jeremiah looked at the heap of fallen blocks, then turned his gaze directly to Sarah. His blue eyes, usually so placid, seemed to hold a profound, ancient sadness. In a voice as clear and solemn as a bell, he said, "Sic transit gloria mundi." So passes the glory of the world. It wasn't just a phrase anymore. It was a commentary, a perfect, devastatingly intelligent observation from her toddler. Sarah felt the floor drop out from under her. This wasn't a quirk. It wasn't a medical issue that an antibiotic could fix. It was something else entirely, something vast and inexplicable unfolding in their small, quiet house in Oakhaven. The silence that followed the collapse of the block tower was heavier than any sound. It filled the small living room, pressing in on Sarah and Mark, a tangible weight of wrongness. Mark stared at the scattered wooden blocks, then at Jeremiah, who was now happily trying to fit a square block into a round hole. He finally looked at Sarah, and for the first time, his confident skepticism was gone, replaced by a flicker of the same raw fear she felt twisting in her gut. "Okay," he said, his voice low and strained. "Okay, that was weird. Really weird." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Sarah knew meant he was truly rattled. "There has to be an explanation, Sarah. There has to be." "What explanation, Mark?" she whispered, clutching her phone so tightly her knuckles were white. The video she'd taken was a burning secret in her palm. That he's a genius, that he learned classical Latin from a cartoon, he's too. That night, sleep was a forgotten luxury. They lay in bed, a chasm of unspoken anxiety between them. Around 2 a.m., Sarah couldn't stand it anymore. She sat up, the screen of her phone casting a ghostly blue light on her face as she played the video again, the audio barely audible. "Sic transit gloria mundi." Mark sat up beside her. "You're going to burn a hole in your phone doing that." "I need you to listen," she said, her voice trembling. "Not just hear it, I need you to understand what this means." She handed him the phone. He took it, his face grim in the pale light. He watched the tiny figure of his son point and speak with an authority that was deeply unsettling. He played it 3 times. Finally, he set the phone down on the nightstand. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice resolute, "we're calling Dr. Miller first thing in the morning. We'll get a proper checkup, a developmental screening. The works. We need data. We need a professional opinion, not this." He gestured vaguely at the phone, at the mystery it contained. It wasn't the validation Sarah craved, but it was a step. It was an admission that something was wrong. She agreed, and they finally drifted into a restless, dream-filled sleep. The next afternoon, they sat in the sterile, beige waiting room of Dr. Alan Miller's practice. The air smelled of antiseptic and old magazines. It was a place of scraped knees and seasonal flus, a bastion of normal, everyday problems. Their problem felt alien here. Jeremiah sat on the floor, contentedly flipping through a picture book, humming a soft, tuneless melody. Every so often, a single, clear word would float up from him. "Flows," he murmured, pointing to a picture of a daisy. "Domus," he said, tapping a drawing of a house. Mark flinched at each word, his jaw tightening. He was trying to hold onto the rational world, the world where toddlers babbled nonsense, not a dead language. Sarah just felt a cold dread seeping deeper into her bones. "The Jenkins family?" a nurse called. Dr. Miller was a kind man in his late 50s, with reassuring eyes and a gentle demeanor. He had been Mark's doctor as a boy, and he delivered Jeremiah. He was a cornerstone of their life in Oak Haven. "So, what seems to be the trouble?" he asked, smiling warmly as he settled behind his desk. Jeremiah climbed onto Sarah's lap, his small head resting against her chest. Sarah looked at Mark, silently pleading for him to start. He cleared his throat. "Well, Alan, it's about Jeremiah's speech development," he began, choosing his words carefully. "It's atypical." "Atypical how? A lisp? Stuttering?" Dr. Miller asked, picking up a pen. "No," Sarah cut in, unable to bear the clinical downplaying. "He's speaking Latin." The pen in Dr. Miller's hand stopped moving. He looked from Sarah's earnest, worried face to Mark's tense one. "Latin? You mean he's repeating something he heard?" "We don't know what he's hearing," Sarah said, her voice rising with a frantic edge. "We don't own any Latin books. We don't watch historical dramas. It just comes out of him, and it's perfect. It makes sense in context." She fumbled for her phone. "Look." She played the video of the block tower. Dr. Miller leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. The childish voice filled the quiet office. "Sic transit Gloria Mundi." The doctor leaned back, a purely astonished look on his face. "My goodness, the pronunciation is impeccable." "We're worried it's neurological," Mark interjected quickly, grabbing for a medical life raft. "Aphasia or something from the savant syndrome spectrum? Cryptomnesia? Maybe he heard it somewhere and it got stuck." Dr. Miller turned his attention to Jeremiah, who was watching him with wide, intelligent eyes. "Well, let's have a look at the little man himself." He performed a standard checkup. He checked Jeremiah's ears, his throat, his reflexes. He listened to his heart and lungs. Through it all, Jeremiah was calm and cooperative. Physically, he was the picture of health. "Everything seems perfectly normal," Dr. Miller said, a note of bewilderment in his voice. "His motor skills are excellent, he's responsive." He sat back on his stool, looking genuinely perplexed. "I've been a pediatrician for 30 years. I've seen kids who could name every dinosaur and kids who could hum Mozart. But this is something else entirely." He looked at Jeremiah again, who was now quietly observing the doctor. Dr. Miller looked tired, the skin under his eyes shadowed from what must have been a long day. In the quiet of the room, Jeremiah slid off Sarah's lap. He walked over to the doctor, his small hand reaching out and gently touching the sleeve of his white coat. He looked up into the tired man's face and spoke in a voice that was soft, clear, and unnervingly compassionate. "Medis cura te ipsum." "Physician, heal thyself." The air left the room. Mark made a small, choked sound. Sarah felt a wave of icy cold wash over her. Dr. Miller simply stared, his mouth slightly agape. The professional, reassuring mask had vanished, replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. He slowly sank back onto his stool. After a long moment, he shook his head, as if trying to wake from a dream. I have no explanation for this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I can run blood tests and EEG, but my gut tells me we won't find anything. This is beyond my expertise." He picked up a notepad, his hand unsteady as he wrote. "I'm referring you to a pediatric neurologist. Dr. Eris Thorne in Indianapolis. He's the best. If there's a neurological component, he'll find it." They walked out of the clinic into the crisp, late autumn air of Oak Haven. The familiar street seemed strange, unreal. They buckled a silent Jeremiah into his car seat. As Mark started the car, he reached across the console and took Sarah's hand. His was cold, but his grip was firm. The skepticism was gone, burned away by two perfect, impossible sentences. They were no longer on opposite sides of a strange puzzle. They were now standing together, staring into the same terrifying abyss. The drive to Indianapolis was a 90-minute study in shared silence. Outside, the flat, monotonous landscape of central Indiana stretched on, a gray-brown canvas under an overcast November sky. Inside the car, the atmosphere was just as bleak. Mark gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his focus absolute. The skepticism that had once been his shield was gone, shattered on the floor of Dr. Miller's office. In its place was a new kind of pragmatism, a desperate, clawing need for a diagnosis, a name, a box to put this nightmare in. A tumor, a seizure disorder, a rare genetic anomaly, any explanation, no matter how terrible, felt preferable to the formless, encroaching dread of the unknown. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, watching the bare trees whip by. Her fear was different from Mark's. It wasn't about finding a medical label. She had moved past that. Her terror was deeper, more ancient. It felt as if some fundamental law of reality had been broken inside her son. In the back, Jeremiah sat quietly in his car seat, looking out his own window, humming a tuneless little song. He was clutching a small, red plastic car, entirely oblivious to the monumental weight of his own existence, a weight that was crushing his parents. Dr. Eris Thorne's office was in a sleek, glass-and-steel medical tower attached to the Riley Hospital for Children. The waiting room was a deliberate paradox of clinical sterility and forced cheerfulness. Brightly colored walls adorned with abstract art that failed to feel playful. It was quiet, professional, and intimidating. When Dr. Thorne's nurse called Jeremiah's name, Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Dr. Thorne himself was exactly as they'd imagined. He was a man in his late 40s, tall and lean, with sharp features and intelligent, assessing eyes behind minimalist wireframe glasses. He didn't offer the folksy sympathy of Dr. Miller. His handshake was firm, his greeting polite but devoid of warmth. He was a scientist, a man who dealt in data and observable phenomena, and he projected an aura of absolute, unshakable competence. "Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins," he began, his voice calm and measured as they settled into the chairs opposite his large, uncluttered desk. Dr. Miller sent over his notes. "They are unusual." He didn't elaborate, instead turning his attention to Jeremiah, who was now exploring a small basket of wooden blocks on the floor. Dr. Thorne watched him for a long moment, his gaze analytical. "So he speaks only Latin, and has done so since he began speaking." Mark, taking the lead, recounted the entire story, from the first shocking phrases to the chillingly accurate comment made to Dr. Miller. He was careful to be precise, sticking to the facts, presenting it like a case file. Sarah interjected occasionally, her voice softer, trying to convey the emotional texture of the events, the confusion, the fear. Throughout their account, Dr. Thorne listened without interruption, his pen making small, meticulous notes on a legal pad. He betrayed no surprise, no disbelief. His expression remained one of intense, professional curiosity. "I see," he said when they were finished. "And the phrases are always contextually appropriate?" "Always," Sarah confirmed, her voice barely a whisper. "Fascinating," Dr. Thorne murmured, more to himself than to them. He then outlined his plan. "I want to start with a full neurological workup, an electroencephalogram to monitor brainwave activity, followed by a high-resolution MRI to look at the physical structure of the brain. We need to rule out any physiological causes first. Seizure activity in the temporal lobe, particularly in the language centers, can sometimes manifest in very strange ways." For the first time since this began, Mark felt a flicker of hope. This was it. A plan, a process, science. The EEG was the first ordeal. A kind technician with patient hands attached a web of wires to Jeremiah's scalp. The boy was surprisingly calm, more curious than scared. He sat in a large, comfortable chair, watching a cartoon on a small screen while the machines silently charted the electrical storms inside his head. Sarah and Mark watched from a small adjoining room through a pane of glass, their hands clasped together. For 20 minutes, the squiggly lines on the monitor rolled by, a secret language far more complex than Latin. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then, as the technician began preparing to remove the electrodes, Jeremiah turned his head slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. He looked directly at the one-way mirror, his blue eyes seeming to pierce right through it and lock onto Dr. Thorne, who had just entered the observation room. In the sterile quiet, his small, clear voice filled the space. "Mens agitat molem." The technician paused, looking over at the observation window in confusion. Mark's blood ran cold. Sarah felt a wave of dizziness. Doctor. Thorne stood perfectly still. He simply stared back at the small boy, his professional mask unwavering. Slowly, he reached for his notepad and jotted down the phrase. He looked at Mark and Sarah. "The mind moves the mass," he translated, his tone flat, academic. Virgil, from the Aeneid. A philosophical concept that the mind is the animating force of the universe, or in this case, the body. He offered no further comment, but the implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jeremiah had just commented on the very nature of the test he was undergoing. The MRI was next. The massive, humming machine was terrifying. Jeremiah had to be sedated, a small mercy for which Sarah was grateful. She couldn't have borne watching him slide consciously into that tight, clamoring tube. She stroked his hair as the sedative took hold, his small body going limp in her arms. She and Mark waited in another sterile room, the rhythmic, percussive banging of the machine sounding like a mechanical heartbeat counting down to a verdict. Hours later, they were back in Dr. Thorne's office. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the room. Dr. Thorne sat opposite them, a series of brain scans illuminated on a large monitor behind him. He steepled his fingers, his expression as neutral as ever. "Well," he began, "I have the results. The EEG is completely normal. No seizure activity, no epileptiform discharges, nothing to suggest any electrical abnormality." He gestured to the screen behind him. "And these are the MRI scans." We took a comprehensive look at his entire brain structure, paying special attention to the Broca's and Wernicke's areas, the primary centers for language. As you can see, they are perfectly formed. There is no tumor, no lesion, no malformation. From a neurological standpoint, your son's brain is entirely, impeccably healthy. Mark stared, uncomprehending. "So, what does that mean? What is it?" Dr. Thorne took a slow breath, the first sign of anything other than clinical detachment. "It means, Mr. Jenkins, that I do not have a diagnosis for you. I have never seen or read about a case like this. The fluency, the contextual relevance, the absence of any neurological pathology, it's unprecedented." He leaned forward slightly. "Science, at this moment, does not have an explanation for what is happening with your son. All I can recommend is continued observation." The words hung in the air, a death sentence to their hope. They had come to the pinnacle of medicine seeking an answer, a cure, a reason. They left with nothing but a confirmation of the impossible. The silence on the drive home was different. It was no longer tense. It was hollow. The drive home from Indianapolis was a 90-minute study in silence. The sterile, conclusive non-conclusion from Dr. Thorne had sucked all the air out of the car, leaving a vacuum filled only by the rhythmic hum of tires on a Minus 65 and the soft, even breaths of Jeremiah, asleep in his car seat. Outside, the Indiana sky was a uniform, unforgiving sheet of gray. The flat landscape of late autumn fields stretching out like a reflection of their own bleak prospects. Sarah stared out the passenger window, her reflection a ghostly image superimposed over the passing scenery of skeletal trees and fallow cornfields. Every mile that brought them closer to Oak Haven felt like a retreat, a surrender. They had marched to the front lines of science, armed with hope and a desperate need for answers, only to be sent back with nothing but a shrug and a medical bill. The words unprecedented and observation echoed in her mind, not as clinical terms, but as a judgment. Their problem was so strange, so far beyond the pale, that the best minds could only offer to watch it unfold, like a slow-motion catastrophe. Mark's hands were clamped on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He hadn't said more than 10 words since they left the hospital parking garage. Sarah could feel his frustration radiating off him in waves. A hard, brittle anger that wasn't directed at her, or at Jeremiah, but at the world itself for ceasing to make sense. Mark was a man who believed in cause and effect, in schematics and blueprints. His world was built on a foundation of logic, and that foundation had just been dynamited. When they finally pulled into their driveway, the familiar sight of their small, two-story house offered no comfort. It looked less like a sanctuary and more like the box they were trapped in. Inside, the silence stretched, taut and fragile. Mark put Jeremiah, still sleeping, into his crib, his movements stiff and mechanical. Sarah stood in the hallway, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, the mundane soundtrack of a life that was no longer normal. The dam broke that evening. After a dinner eaten in near silence, Sarah was clearing the table while Mark stared into a cup of coffee as if it held the secrets of the universe. "We can't just do nothing, Mark," she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the heavy air. He looked up, his eyes weary. "What do you suggest, Sarah? Dr. Thorne is one of the best pediatric neurologists in the country. He ran every test imaginable. There's nothing to do," he said, to observe. Observe what? Him speaking perfect Latin until he's 18? Him living a life where no one understands him, where we don't understand him? Her voice started to rise, sharpened by a fear she could no longer contain. "That's not a plan, it's a surrender." "So what's the alternative?" he shot back, his frustration finally spilling over. "Do we go looking for witch doctors? Exorcists? Is that what you want?" The accusation hung in the air, ugly and unfair. "Of course not," she said, her voice dropping, wounded. "Don't be ridiculous. I'm just saying that maybe we've been asking the wrong people. We've been treating this like a medical problem. Because our son has a condition that isn't normal. That's what you do with a medical problem. You go to a doctor, and the doctor said there's nothing medically wrong with him." Sarah's hands were trembling. She gripped the edge of the sink. "His brain is perfect. Physically, he's perfect. So maybe the problem isn't medical. Maybe it's something else." Later that night, unable to sleep, Sarah sat in the faint glow of her laptop. She had typed "Ancient Languages Expert Indiana" into the search bar, her fingers hovering over the keyboard with a mix of desperation and shame. It felt like a betrayal of the rational world she and Mark had always inhabited. But the path of reason had led to a dead end. She found a name: Dr. Alastair Finch, a professor of classics and linguistics at Purdue University, an hour's drive away. His faculty page listed his specialties: late Imperial Latin, comparative philology, the evolution of ancient dialects. He had written books with titles she didn't understand. He seemed impossibly academic, impossibly removed from their bizarre reality. But he was a new door, maybe the last one. She brought it up the next morning. Mark was getting ready for work, the routine a flimsy shield against the chaos they were living in. "I found someone," she said, standing in the doorway of their bedroom. Mark paused, buttoning his shirt. "Someone. What kind of someone?" "A professor at Purdue. He's an expert in classical languages, in Latin." Mark stopped. He turned to face her slowly, his expression a mixture of disbelief and pity. "A professor? Sarah, what is a literature professor going to tell us? That our son is speaking Latin? We know that. We paid a neurologist thousands of dollars to confirm that and tell us he doesn't know why." "He's not a literature professor, he's a linguist," she insisted, her voice pleading. "He studies the structure of the language, its history. Maybe he could tell us what kind of Latin it is, if it's from a specific time, a specific region. Maybe there's a clue in the language itself." "A clue to what?" Mark's voice was getting louder. "That he was a Roman senator in a past life? Is that where we're going with this? Because I can't, Sarah, I just can't." He ran a hand through his hair, his composure cracking. "My world it's falling apart. I need something solid to hold on to. Science was supposed to be solid. Dr. Thorne was solid. He gave us a solid answer. I don't know, and I have to accept that. Chasing after some academic for a linguistic footnote feels insane. It feels like we're giving up on reality." Suddenly, a small voice came from the hallway. "Mater, Noli Fleer." They both froze. Jeremiah was standing there in his dinosaur pajamas, his small hand rubbing his eye. He was looking at Sarah, his expression one of pure, childish concern. He had seen the tears welling in her eyes. "Mother, do not cry." The simple, elegant phrase, spoken with perfect intonation, was more devastating than any argument. It was a direct line from his heart to hers, in a language that should have been a wall between them. Sarah knelt and hugged him, burying her face in his soft hair, the tears now flowing freely. Over his small shoulder, she looked at Mark. His face was a mask of anguish. The proof of their problem was standing right there, comforting his mother in a dead language, and it was tearing them apart. Mark simply shook his head, a gesture of complete defeat, and walked out of the room. The chasm between them had never felt so wide. They were alone together. The days following their return from Indianapolis were suffocating. The silence in the Jenkins home was a physical presence, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the soft click of Jeremiah's wooden blocks and the unnervingly clear sound of his Latin. Mark had retreated into a fortress of stoicism, his face a mask of weary resolve. He went to work, came home, read the paper, and avoided Sarah's eyes, treating the problem of their son as a wound that would heal if only they stopped prodding it. For Sarah, this inaction was a slow-burning torture. Every phrase Jeremiah uttered, labor omnia vincit, as he struggled to fit a block into place. Lux in tenebris, when she switched on the kitchen light in the morning, was a fresh splinter in her heart. He was her son, her beautiful, enigmatic boy, trapped in a puzzle she couldn't solve, and his father was content to simply watch. Her decision solidified on a Tuesday morning. The air was cool with the promise of an Indiana autumn, the sky a crisp, cloudless blue. Mark was getting ready for work, the sound of his electric razor a dull buzz from the bathroom. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, watching Jeremiah carefully arrange his animal figures. He looked up at her, his eyes the same deep blue as Mark's, and said with perfect, gentle clarity, "Mater noli timer." "Mother, do not be afraid." It shattered the last of her hesitation. It wasn't just a random phrase, it was a direct comfort, a plea. He knew. Somehow, on some level, her little boy knew she was terrified, and he was trying to reassure her. The weight of Mark's disapproval suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the weight of her son's plea. With trembling hands, she looked up Purdue University's Department of Classics. Professor Alastair Finch's name was at the top of the faculty list. His profile photo showing a man in his late 60s, with kind eyes behind thick spectacles and a neatly trimmed white beard. His list of publications was long and intimidating. Taking a deep breath, Sarah carried her phone into the pantry, closed the door, and dialed his office number. An administrative assistant answered, her voice professionally bored. Sarah's carefully rehearsed speech came out in a clumsy, breathless rush. "My name is Sarah Jenkins. I need to speak with Professor Finch about a linguistic anomaly. It's about my son." The assistant's skepticism was audible. "The professor is very busy, ma'am. Does this have to do with university enrollment?" "No, he speaks Latin. My son, he's 3. A pause. "I see. I can take a message." Defeated, Sarah left her name and number, certain the message would end up in a trash bin. But to her astonishment, her phone rang 2 hours later. The number was from the university. "This is Alastair Finch," a calm, baritone voice said. "I received a rather curious message. You say your 3-year-old son speaks Latin?" "Yes, Professor, exclusively and fluently." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "I know how it sounds." "Indeed," Dr. Finch replied, his tone a careful blend of academic politeness and disbelief. "Mrs. Jenkins, are you certain it's not simply phonetic mimicry? Perhaps from a television program or a game?" "No," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "He understands it. He responds to situations. I have recordings." This seemed to pique his interest. The professional curiosity in his voice edged out the skepticism. "Recordings, you say? That is interesting. I am on campus tomorrow. My schedule is tight, but I have a window at 2 p.m. Can you be in West Lafayette?" "Yes," Sarah said without a second thought. "I'll be there." The next day, she told Mark she was driving to Lafayette to visit a college friend she hadn't seen in years. The lie felt like ash in her mouth. Mark barely looked up from his toast. "Okay, drive safe." His disinterest was its own form of permission, a quiet abdication of his role in this search. It hurt, but it also set her free. The hour-long drive north on a Minna 65 was a blur of flat cornfields stretching toward the horizon. Sarah felt a volatile mix of guilt, anxiety, and a fragile, desperate hope. She was betraying her husband's trust, chasing what he called an irrational fantasy. But as she gripped the steering wheel, Jeremiah's voice echoed in her mind. Mater noli timer. Purdue's campus was sprawling and impressive. She found the liberal arts building and, after getting lost in a maze of hallways, located Professor Finch's office. It was exactly as she'd imagined. A small, cluttered sanctuary where books were stacked on every available surface, threatening to spill onto the floor. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and brewing tea. Professor Finch stood to greet her. He was smaller in person, but his presence filled the room. He gestured to a worn armchair. "Mrs. Jenkins, thank you for coming. Now please tell me everything." For 20 minutes, Sarah recounted the entire story, from the first words to the neurologist's baffled conclusion. Professor Finch listened intently, his fingers steepled under his chin, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair. "It's a fascinating narrative, Mrs. Jenkins, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. May I hear these recordings?" Sarah's hands shook as she took out her phone and played the first file, Jeremiah describing the falling block tower. Sic transit Gloria Mundi. Finch's eyebrows rose slightly. He listened to the next one, Jeremiah's comment to Dr. Miller. Metis cura te ipsum. Finally, she played the clip from the EEG. Mens agitat molem. As the last phrase faded, a profound silence settled over the office. Professor Finch was no longer looking at her. He was staring at the wall, his eyes distant. The polite academic skepticism had vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated astonishment. He leaned forward, his voice low and intense. The pronunciation, it's flawless classical, but the first phrase, the one about glory, that's more commonly ecclesiastical. The one for the doctor is a vulgate proverb, and mens agitat molem is from Virgil's Aeneid. He's not speaking one form of Latin. He's speaking several with the diction and context of a seasoned scholar. Has he been exposed to any of these texts? No, never. We're not religious, and we don't have classic literature in the house. Professor Finch removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, looking truly bewildered for the first time. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I am a linguist. I spend my life studying the acquisition and structure of language. What you are describing, what these recordings demonstrate, it should not be possible. It defies every known model of language development. This isn't just a child who speaks Latin." He looked directly at her, his eyes wide with a terrifying awe. "This is something else entirely. The drive back to Oak Haven from Purdue was a 90-minute blur of gray asphalt and bruised purple Midwestern sky." The weight of Professor Finch's words pressed down on Sarah, heavier than the impending rain. Unprecedented, defies all known models of language acquisition. He hadn't given her an answer, he'd given her a bigger, more terrifying question. He had, however, given her a sliver of validation. She wasn't crazy. What was happening to Jeremiah was real, so real that it had stunned a leading expert in the field. Clutched in her purse was a business card with Finch's direct line and a promise that he would email a more formal, structured proposal for observation within a day. A path forward, but it was a path she would have to walk alone, at least for now. She pulled into their driveway as dusk settled, the familiar shape of their modest home offering little comfort. Inside, the lights were on. Mark's truck was parked where it always was. He was home. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of guilt and fear. She had constructed the lie so easily, a visit to an old college friend in Lafayette who was going through a tough time. It was plausible, simple. But now, returning from that lie, it felt flimsy and foolish, a paper shield against the truth. Mark was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters. Jeremiah was on the floor, building a surprisingly complex structure with his wooden blocks. He looked up when she entered, a quiet relief washing over his face. He'd tried to be strong for Jeremiah, but she could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes. "Hey," he said, his voice softer than it had been in days. "How's Amber?" "She's hanging in there," Sarah replied, the name of her fictional friend tasting like ash in her mouth. It was good to see her. She bent down and kissed Jeremiah's head, inhaling the familiar scent of his hair. He looked up at her and smiled, a pure, uncomplicated gesture that made her secret feel all the more treacherous. He patted the floor next to him, an invitation to join. "I'm glad you went," Mark said, leaning against the counter. Maybe I overreacted about the professor thing. It's just this is our son, not some science experiment." It was as close to an apology as he was capable of, a tentative peace offering. And it made her deception feel like a dagger she was about to twist. "I know, Mark. I get it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The next afternoon, the email arrived. The subject line read, "Regarding Jeremiah Jenkins, a proposed observational framework." Her hands trembled as she opened it on her laptop at the kitchen table. Professor Finch had been thorough. He proposed a non-invasive study, conducted primarily in their home. It would involve weekly sessions, recorded on video, where he would interact with Jeremiah, introducing specific stimuli, images, objects, stories, to observe his linguistic responses. He stressed confidentiality, ethics, and the academic importance of the study. It wasn't a cure, but it was a plan. It was structure in the middle of chaos. It was hope. She was so absorbed in the document, tracing the lines of the proposal with her finger, that she didn't hear Mark come downstairs. He was supposed to be fixing a leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom. "Forgot the wrench," he said, walking into the kitchen. He stopped. His eyes flickered from her face, pale and intense, to the laptop screen. He was still several feet away, but he didn't need to be closer. The subject line was clear as day. "Regarding Jeremiah Jenkins," he read aloud, his voice flat and cold, devoid of the warmth from the night before. The air in the room instantly dropped 20 degrees. "A proposed observational framework." Sarah slammed the laptop shut, a useless, panicked reflex. "Mark, I can explain." "You can explain?" He took a step closer, his face a mask of disbelief and betrayal. "You went to Purdue, didn't you? There is no Amber." It wasn't a question. "I had to do something," she cried, her voice cracking. "You wanted to just observe. You wanted to pretend it would just go away. I couldn't, Mark, I can't. So you went behind my back, you lied to my face and took our son to be, what? Analyzed. Put under a microscope by some stranger?" The hurt in his voice was sharp, a physical thing. "I said he wasn't an experiment, Sarah, and the very next day you signed him up for one. He's not signed up for anything. It's a proposal. He's a professor, a linguist, and he confirmed it, Mark. He said it's real. He said it's impossible, that Jeremiah is speaking a perfect, complex blend of Latin that he could not possibly have learned. He's as stunned as we are. I don't care what some professor thinks." Mark's voice rose, the raw frustration of the past weeks finally boiling over. "I care that my wife lied to me, that you see our son's problem as something to be paraded around for academia. What's next? A book deal? A talk show tour? The boy who speaks dead languages?" The accusations stung, sharp and unfair. "How can you say that? I'm trying to help him. I'm trying to understand. Something you refuse to do. I'm trying to protect him. From people exactly like your Professor Finch, who will see him as a curiosity, a freak. And from his own mother, apparently." The word, freak, hung in the air between them, ugly and toxic. They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen, the chasm that had been slowly opening between them, now a vast, unbridgeable canyon. Tears streamed down Sarah's face, hot and silent. Mark's jaw was clenched, his knuckles white where he gripped the back of a chair. It was then that the quiet from the living room ended. Small footsteps padded across the hardwood floor. Jeremiah appeared in the doorway, his favorite wooden block clutched in his hand. He looked from his mother's weeping face to his father's rigid, angry form. The tension in the room was a palpable force, thick and suffocating. He took a hesitant step forward, his gaze fixed solely on his father. He looked directly into Mark's eyes, a gaze of unnerving perception. Then, in a clear, calm voice that cut through the rage and sorrow, he spoke. It wasn't a plea or a cry. It was a statement, imbued with an impossible knowing. Menshura pater bis semel secer. Mark froze, every ounce of anger drained from his body, replaced by a wave of ice-cold shock. His face went slack. The phrase measure, father twice, cut once wasn't just a saying. It was his own father's mantra. A carpenter by trade, a man of precision and care, he had repeated that exact phrase to Mark 1,000 times in his workshop, a place that had been Mark's sanctuary as a boy. He could hear it now, not in Jeremiah's small voice, but in his father's gruff, loving tone, a voice he hadn't heard in 15 years. No one else could know that. Not Sarah, not a book, not the internet. The fight was over. The argument about lies and secrets evaporated, rendered meaningless by 5 impossible words. Mark stared at his 3-year-old son, who was not just speaking Latin, but was speaking the private language of his own history, a dialect of the heart. The phenomenon he had tried so hard to rationalize, to ignore, to contain, had just reached out and touched the deepest part of his soul. The silence that fell in the living room was heavier than any sound. It pressed down on them, thick with the impossible truth of what had just happened. Mark stood frozen, his face drained of color, his eyes locked on his son. The phrase menshura pater bis semel secer echoed not in the air, but inside his skull. It was a ghost from his own past, a private piece of his history spoken aloud by a child who could not possibly know it. The anger that had fueled his argument with Sarah moments before evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollowing dread that was far worse than fear. It was the dread of utter incomprehension. He slowly, shakily, knelt down until he was eye level with Jeremiah. The boy's expression was neutral, calm, as if he had simply commented on the weather. There was no guile, no mimicry. There was only an unnerving, ancient placidity. Mark's gaze lifted to Sarah. Her face was a mask of vindication and terror. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she made no sound. In her eyes, he saw not an "I told you so," but a plea. Do you see it now? Do you finally see? His own throat was tight. He reached out a trembling hand, not to Jeremiah, but to Sarah, his fingers finding hers across the small space that had felt like a chasm just minutes ago. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words brittle. "Sarah, I am so sorry. I didn't see." The apology wasn't just for the argument or for discovering the email. It was for months of denial, for the stubborn pragmatism that had blinded him to the miracle or the curse living in his own home. The fight was over. Their separate struggles had merged into a single, shared path into the unknown. The next morning, the Oak Haven sky was a flat, indifferent gray. Mark sat at the kitchen table, the laptop open to Professor Finch's email. Sarah sat beside him, a hand resting on his arm, their coffee growing cold. There was no more debate. It was Mark who composed the reply. "Professor Finch," he typed, his fingers clumsy on the keyboard. "My name is Mark Jenkins, Jeremiah's father. My wife, Sarah, shared your correspondence with me. We have discussed your proposal for a structured in-home study. We accept. We need to understand. Please let us know when you can begin." He hit send before he could second-guess himself. The response came in less than an hour. Professor Alastair Finch was eager, professional, and audibly thrilled. He proposed his first visit for the following Saturday. For the first time in months, Mark and Sarah weren't fighting against a problem. They were facing it together. Thus began the years of observation. Alastair Finch became a quiet, recurring presence in their lives. He never treated Jeremiah like a specimen, but like a prodigy of an unknown art. His notebooks filled with transcriptions, his recorders capturing hours of a small boy speaking the tongue of Caesars as if it were his native dialect. The visits were methodical. Finch would present picture cards, and Jeremiah, now 5, would describe them not with simple nouns, but with complex, grammatically perfect sentences. A picture of a bird in a cage elicited, "Alis natus non claustris," born for wings, not for cages. Life settled into a new, strange rhythm. The stares from other parents at the park never ceased, but Mark and Sarah learned to build a protective wall around their son. When Jeremiah, at 6, saw a wilting flower in their yard and murmured, "Sic perunt omnia," thus all things perish, Sarah no longer flinched. She simply knelt beside him and said, "Yes, but we can plant new ones in the spring." They learned to live within the phenomenon, to embrace its poetic, often melancholic beauty. Jeremiah was a happy child, full of laughter and warmth. The Latin was not a burden to him, it was simply the language of his soul. Their marriage, once fractured by the mystery, was reforged by it. Their shared purpose, to give Jeremiah a loving, stable life in the face of the inexplicable, became the bedrock of their relationship. They were a team, united against a world that could never understand. Years passed like the turning of pages. 7, then 8. Jeremiah grew, his command of Latin deepening, becoming more nuanced, more philosophical. Finch's research yielded a groundbreaking, if controversial, thesis on innate language structures, but it offered no ultimate explanation. It was, as he often said, simply documenting a miracle. Then came the week of Jeremiah's 9th birthday. The air in the house began to feel different, quieter. An unspoken tension gathered like the stillness before a storm. It was a Tuesday evening, 9 days before the party they had planned. The Indiana winter had settled in, frosting the windows. Mark was helping Jeremiah with a puzzle on the living room floor, a detailed map of the Roman Empire. Sarah was on the couch, reading, the soft lamplight casting a warm glow over the scene. Jeremiah fitted the final piece, the small territory of Judea, into place. He sat back on his heels, his expression serene. He looked at the completed map, then his gaze drifted up to meet his father's eyes, and then his mother's. There was a profound and gentle gravity in his look that made the breath catch in Sarah's throat. He spoke, his voice as clear and steady as a bell. The Latin was simple, direct, and stripped of all poetry. "Novum dies," he said, holding his mother's gaze. "Et erit finis." Mark's heart hammered against his ribs. He understood enough to feel a primal chill sweep through him. He looked to Sarah, whose face had gone ashen. She knew. They both knew. "What did you say, buddy?" Mark asked, his voice strained. Jeremiah turned to him, a faint, reassuring smile on his lips. He repeated it, adding a single word for clarity. "Novum dies, pater. Tunc finis est mihi." 9 days, father. Then it is the end for me. He delivered the statement not as a prophecy or a warning, but as a simple, incontrovertible fact, like stating the color of the sky. Seeing the terror bloom on his mother's face, he pushed himself up, walked over to her, and placed a small hand on her cheek. His touch was warm. "Noli dolor, mater," he whispered, his voice impossibly soft. "Pax erit." Do not grieve, mother. There will be peace. And with that, he went back to his puzzle, tracing the borders of the ancient world with his finger. The boy who heard voices in Latin had spoken his final, terrible truth. In the silent living room, Mark and Sarah held each other, the years of searching, fighting, and accepting collapsing into this single, crushing moment of certainty. There were no more questions. The mystery was solved, and they were left with nothing but the quiet, relentless ticking of the clock, counting down the 9 remaining days of their son's life.